When a person loses someone close, time stretches, and reality begins to shift. A father set out into the Appalachians to search for his son, who had not been seen for a month. The trails were changing, the forest sending strange signs, and the abandoned ranger's cabin seemed like a mirror of his own fears. Every step made him doubt. Was he walking toward his son, or toward something else entirely? He walked slowly, trying not to make a sound, but each step echoed in the silence of the forest, like a tiny bell striking. The path he thought he knew from the map suddenly felt strange. The trail twisted differently than on paper, and every fork, every turn seemed deliberate. He stopped, looked around. The dense trees stretched toward the sky, their branches intertwined, forming almost a dome through which only a faint light broke. The wind here was unusual. It didn't rustle the leaves in the usual way, but seemed to glide along the skin, crawling inside, making him shiver. On the bark of the trees, he noticed fresh scratches, long and deep, as if someone had intentionally drawn their hands along the trunks. Sometimes, for a fleeting moment, it seemed like finger-like silhouettes, someone's invisible hands. The birds were silent, though he remembered that at this season, the forest was usually full of their songs. The silence was oppressive, but not empty. It was filled with something unclear, almost tangible. He recalled the stories locals told about the ranger who had disappeared here decades ago. Old hikers said he still watched the trails, warning or testing. The father didn't believe in ghosts, but now every movement in the shadows made his heart beat faster. It seemed the forest was observing him, assessing his steps, anticipating where he would go next. The trail unexpectedly led to an old, overgrown bridge across a creek. The wooden beams were creaky and fragile, but he crossed carefully, feeling the cold water brushing against his boots. When he looked back, the bridge already seemed different. The beams quivered under the slightest breeze, as if the bridge itself wanted to show that everything here changes. He took a step, and the thought flashed through his mind. What if the forest is alive? Suddenly, he noticed an abandoned ranger's cabin among the trees. It stood unnaturally upright, though according to the map, there shouldn't have been any structures here. The wooden boards creaked in the wind. The paint peeled, the windows were dusty. The cabin seemed at once inviting and warning. He approached it, heart pounding. Every step echoed, stretching through the forest like a long thread of anxiety. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it gently. Inside, a dim room, smelling of dust and moss. His gaze fell on old photographs of hikers and the ranger, yellow diaries and maps. His eyes caught a diary. On the cover, a strange warning, almost illegible, but one word was clear: do not return. The words didn't feel like a warning, but an observation. Someone already knew he had come. Suddenly, in the half-darkness, a figure flickered, barely noticeable, transparent, an old man with a cane. He didn't take a step, didn't make a sound, but his gaze seemed penetrating, measuring, as if the ranger's spirit was testing whether the visitor was ready to understand the secrets of this place. The father felt a chill in his chest, a mix of fear, anxiety, and curiosity. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls, and every rustle seemed like a message. You are close, but do not seek too much, or you will lose everything. He stepped toward the table and felt as if something inside the cabin was watching every movement. The half-light thickened, and in that moment, the room seemed to inhale with him. Every shadow stretched unnaturally, crawling along the walls as if alive, and the floor beneath him creaked under the weight of 1,000 unseen steps. He froze, his hand resting on the diary. The words, "do not return," burning in his mind like a warning that was too late. The air was heavier here, saturated with something he could not name, a presence that was not merely watching, but breathing, moving, waiting. He leaned closer to the table, eyes scanning the pages. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, almost frantic. Notes about travelers who had come and gone. Maps with routes crossed out and red marks in strange symbols he didn't understand. But then, in the margin of one page, he noticed a sketch. A figure, faint, hunched, holding a cane, eyes hollow yet piercing. His breath caught. It was the ranger, but not quite human, drawn as though seen through memory and something else entirely. And beside the figure, a small note in the same jagged handwriting. He watches. He waits. He decides. A sudden creak behind him made him spin. Nothing, just the walls and the shadows. But his gut tightened. The room had changed. The temperature dropped so sharply he could see his breath in the dim light. The diary slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud, though the sound seemed amplified, echoing like a warning. He wanted to leave, to run back into the forest, to escape the oppressive stillness of the cabin. But something rooted him in place, a mixture of dread and curiosity, an unexplainable pull. It was as though the house itself demanded he stay, demanded he look, demanded he understand what had been hidden for decades. The shadows along the walls began to shift more noticeably. At first, he thought it was the fading light, but then a movement, subtle, deliberate, drew his gaze. A corner of the room darkened, and there it was, the figure again. Not fully solid, not fully gone, a shimmer like heat haze over asphalt. The ranger, standing silently, observing, his presence simultaneously terrifying and commanding. The father's heart hammered. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet his legs refused to move. The diary lay at his feet, but the urge to pick it up and read further was irresistible. Trembling, he stooped, his fingers brushing the brittle pages. The sketches seemed to move under his touch, the eyes of the drawn ranger following him. A whisper, barely audible, slithered through the room. He could not tell if it came from the shadows, the wind, or the cabin itself. He has come, he seeks. He will learn, or be claimed. The words, if they were words, reverberated in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight. The father swallowed hard, a cold lump in his throat. This was no ordinary forest, no ordinary disappearance. Footsteps, not his own, not human, from the corner of the room, from nowhere and everywhere at once, a sound of deliberate, measured walking. Each step made the floor vibrate slightly, though nothing could be seen. His pulse raced. The diary's pages fluttered as if caught in a windless gust. The ranger's figure became sharper, more defined, yet somehow insubstantial, as if reality itself bent around him. Then a smell, musty, earthy, like damp leaves and old timber, filled the cabin, sharper than any smell should be. It carried with it a sense of age, of time folded over itself, of memories trapped in the walls. And with it came a vision, or perhaps an impression, a boy walking alone through the forest, pausing as if sensing something behind him. The father's breath hitched. The figure in the diary, the whispers, the shifting shadows, it was all connected. And suddenly he knew, the forest does not simply hide. It chooses. A sudden movement made him flinch. The diary lifted slightly, as if held by invisible fingers. His heart pounded violently. The light flickered. The shadows elongated, reaching toward him. The father's mind raced, a storm of fear, disbelief, and a desperate hope that he might find his son. Yet deep inside, he understood something he could not shake. This place was alive. It remembered, it judged, and he was not yet ready to meet whatever waited at the center of it all. Then, silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and fills your chest with weight. He dared not move, and in that silence, a single thought screamed through him. He is here. And he is waiting. The diary slipped completely from his hands and landed open, face up. The page was blank, except for a single, newly inscribed sentence, written in a hand not his own. You have come. Now, he will see you. The father froze, every muscle locked. The room seemed to pulse around him, shadows quivering like living things. The pull he had felt since entering the cabin became undeniable, a tug at his very consciousness, drawing him toward the unknown, toward something that wanted to reveal itself. And then, faintly at first, a sound, the soft, deliberate shuffle of a cane against the wooden floorboards. He couldn't see the ranger clearly, but he could sense him, a presence at the edge of perception, watching, waiting. The father's pulse thrummed in his ears as adrenaline and fear collided. Every instinct screamed escape, but he could not move. He was trapped in the cabin, in time itself, in a moment that stretched and twisted. The half-light thickened further, shadows bleeding into corners where no light could reach. And at that moment, He understood something terrifying. The cabin was not just a building. It was a memory. It was a warning. It was alive, and it knew he had come seeking what should never be found. The silence in the house became unbearable, pressing against his ears, filling his chest with a weight that made each breath a struggle. He stood frozen, staring at the diary lying open on the table, its blank pages whispering secrets he could not yet understand. The shadows in the room had thickened, pooling in corners like liquid darkness, stretching and shrinking with a rhythm that mirrored his own racing heart. Then, faintly at first, a sound, soft, uneven steps echoing somewhere deep in the room. Not his own, not human. The father's muscles tensed as the hairs on the back of his neck rose. The diary trembled, pages fluttering without wind, and the temperature dropped so sharply he could see his breath curl in the dim light. A whisper followed, threading through the still air. He has come. He seeks. He will learn. It was barely audible, almost swallowed by the oppressive silence, but its meaning cut through the room like a knife. The father's throat tightened. The forest, the house, the diary. It all converged here, in this moment. Then movement. Shadows peeled away from the walls, coalescing into forms, and the figure of the ranger became solid enough to see clearly. His face was indistinct but severe, eyes hollow yet all-seeing, and he leaned on his cane as though the weight of decades pressed down through him. The father swallowed hard, unable to speak, caught in the pull of fear and fascination. And then, a presence behind the ranger, faint, trembling, almost transparent. The father's breath hitched. He knew instantly it was his son, not fully alive, not fully gone, a spectral echo of the boy he had loved, wandering the house in a state between worlds. The boy's eyes met his, wide and unblinking, filled with a strange mixture of recognition and distance. Time seemed to fracture, stretching, folding back on itself, and the father felt a dizzying sense of the temporal line snapping, past, present, and the forest's memory collapsing into a single unbearable instant. The ranger's gaze shifted toward the boy, not hostile but commanding. He raised a hand slightly, and the sun froze, suspended between motion and stillness. The father's heart lurched. Everything, the forest, the house, the shadows, pulsed with a rhythm that seemed alive, a heartbeat that was not his own. And then a sound like shattering glass filled the room, or maybe it was the mind's echo of recognition, of understanding that this moment was both inevitable and impossible. The father stepped closer, trembling. "Son." His voice cracked, barely a whisper. The boy's form flickered, like a candle struggling against the wind, and then stabilized. He raised a hand slowly, pointing toward a corner of the house where a faint trail of light glimmered across the floor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it pulled the father forward, a compass needle aligned to memory and hope. The ranger shifted again, moving with a slow deliberation that made the house feel alive. His presence was overwhelming, a weight pressing into the father's chest, but he did not speak. Instead, he gestured slightly, as if urging the father to see what must be seen. And then, the whisper returned, louder now, slicing through the room like wind through broken glass. "You cannot leave. Not yet. You must understand." Time seemed to elongate. Shadows stretched and curled around the trio, folding in on themselves. The father's mind raced, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to flee, but his feet remained rooted. The son's spectral form drifted closer, eyes locking with the father's, and for a moment, reality and memory collided. He saw flashes, his son laughing in sunlight, stumbling through the forest, disappearing into mist. Then the house's shadows absorbed everything, leaving only the oppressive awareness of the ranger's presence and the fragile echo of his child. A sudden gust slammed through the house, rattling boards, blowing dust and old papers into the air. The boy's form shivered violently, as if resisting some unseen pull, and the ranger's eyes glowed faintly in the half-light, unblinking. The father felt his stomach drop, the sensation of falling without moving. The room warped around him. Walls stretched, floorboards groaned, and the temporal line snapped once again. Past, present, and spectral memory converged into a single point of unbearable tension. Then silence. Thick, suffocating, alive. The boy drifted closer, almost within reach, but not quite, his hand trembling. The ranger leaned forward, the cane striking the floor with a deliberate, echoing tap. The father's chest tightened, adrenaline spiking like fire in his veins. Every hair on his body stood on end. And then, a sound, a scream, or perhaps a word, impossibly soft and distant, whispered through the walls. "Father." The father staggered, eyes wide, as the house seemed to pulse with energy. The boy's form flickered between the spectral and the almost real. The ranger's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, and the father realized this was not simply a haunting. This was a trial, a moment stretched across memory, will, and time itself. One wrong move, one misstep, and he would lose everything. The shadows tightened, pressing closer, the air vibrating with a hum of unseen energy. The father raised his hand tentatively toward his son. At that instant, the boy reached back. Their fingers almost touched, and the world exploded into a piercing clarity of sound, light, and sensation. A shudder ran through the house, the ranger's figure shimmering violently, and for a heartbeat, the father felt the full weight of the forest, the house, the spirits, and the raw, fragile hope of reunion. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything fell into an uneasy stillness. The boy's form floated a few feet away, flickering softly, and the ranger leaned back, silent but ever watchful. The air trembled, thick with memory and warning. The father knew the house had chosen its moments, bending the temporal line, showing him fragments of what was, what is, and what could be. And somewhere deep inside, he understood the first truth of the forest. Nothing here was fully gone, nothing was fully safe, and the line between living and spectral, past and present, could snap at any moment. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to do something, but he stood there paralyzed, trapped between terror and the impossible hope flickering in front of him. The house around him seemed to breathe, the walls expanding and contracting in slow, unnatural rhythms, as if the building itself was waiting for his next choice. His son's ghost hovered only a few steps away, barely held together by a thin, trembling light. The ranger's spirit stood behind the boy, rigid, silent, his presence so heavy it felt like the floor bowed beneath it. And for a moment, just one, the father felt the world pause. Then the boy lifted his hand again. Only this time, the gesture wasn't toward a corner of the room. It wasn't toward the door. It wasn't even toward the father. It was toward the diary, the old, warped diary lying open on the table. The father turned his head, heart pounding, and there, now clearly visible on the page, was a line of text that hadn't been there moments before. Jagged, uneven handwriting, carved into the paper with pressure so strong it almost tore through. He died at this house. The father's breath caught. Ice spread across his spine. And then another line burned itself onto the paper, letters etching themselves in front of his eyes, but not when you think. A sudden crack split the air, the ranger's cane slamming against the floor. The boy's ghost convulsed violently, pulled backward as though the house itself had hooked into him. The father lunged forward, reaching out, desperate, screaming his son's name, but he heard something he had never expected. Not the boy's voice, someone older, weaker, broken. You weren't there. The father froze. The boy's ghost flickered wildly, trapped in the ranger's shadow. Then the diary wrote one last sentence. Slowly, painfully, like a confession forced out of the forest itself. Your son didn't get lost. He followed me here. The ranger stepped forward, and for the first time, his face became clear. Not blank, not monstrous, human, sorrowful, and unmistakably familiar. The father's knees buckled, because he knew that face. Not from this forest, not from this house, but from an old photograph his son kept tucked into the back of his pack. The photograph of the stranger who once saved him on a trail, years before, after he wandered too far from camp. The ranger wasn't haunting his son. He had been protecting him, guiding him when the father couldn't. But the truth was far worse than the father had imagined. The boy's ghost reached forward one last time, and whispered, barely audible, a final, fractured truth. Dad, I didn't disappear to leave you. I followed him because he said you'd never make it in time. The house exhaled. The lights died. The boy vanished. The ranger faded into the dark. And the father was left standing alone in the ruined silence, holding a diary that still trembled in his hands, the ink of his son's final message still wet. The father froze, Those words weren't just strange. They were wrong in a way that hit somewhere deep, somewhere instinctual. The boy's voice trembled, the edges of his form flickering like a candle about to die. Before the father could speak, the ranger shifted, not toward the boy, but toward him. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. The floor creaked under the weight of something old, something that did not belong among the living. The boy raised his hand, desperate now. "Dad, don't." The rest collapsed into silence. A pressure filled the room, thick enough to feel in the lungs. The ranger's hollow gaze locked onto the father's, and for the first time, the father understood the expression behind it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't warning, it was recognition. The boy stepped back, fading like breath on cold glass, his eyes fixed on his father with a plea he couldn't voice. The light around him dimmed until only his outline remained, reaching, failing, dissolving. And then he was gone. The house went still, the forest outside, silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. The father didn't remember leaving. He didn't remember the walk back. He only remembered opening his eyes hours later on the forest road, knees in the dirt, the house nowhere in sight. Search teams combed the area for days. No footprints, no broken branches, no structure matching the one he described. But they did find one thing. A journal page, not old and yellowed like the rest, but clean, crisp, recent. On it, written in the shaky handwriting of a teenage boy, "He said you wouldn't make it in time." The father still doesn't talk about what he saw in that house. Not about the ranger, not about the silence, not about why his son would follow a stranger into the trees. But every year, on the same night, he returns to the edge of that forest. Not to search, not to hope, to listen. Because sometimes, just for a second, he hears footsteps behind him. Soft, uneven, exactly like before, and he knows the story didn't end.